And so we are happy to have you join us for Privacy, Intellectual Property, and the Future of Free Inquiry on College Campuses. To my left, we have AP Anderson, Research and Instruction Librarian at Texas A&M University-Commerce. Zephyr Rankin, Marketing and Communications Librarian at TAMUC. And Dr. Gavin Johnson, Assistant Professor of English and Director of Writing at TAMUC. So let's start off with a question about your research, right? You come as librarians, as rhetoric and composition scholar, as a writing program administrator. How has your own research and or learning been impacted by privacy concerns?
I can go first. So one of the things that has been really impactful for me is that the idea of privacy and surveillance has really opened my research up in a different way than what it was before. My original research trajectory was always teaching with digital media, teaching with technology, but hadn't really thought about issues of privacy and surveillance. Really had a techno optimism about what I was doing. And then a few years ago, I was able to write an article that was included in a collection on rhetorical surveillance, and that kind of started off some of my work. But then when I got hired for this job and started working closely with Charles, I realized that a lot of what I really want to talk about, issues of power, issues of student rights, and how their data is used, actually are questions of surveillance and privacy. So for me, the issue of privacy has really opened up my research agenda in new and exciting ways that I didn't think about 2-3 years ago. And also, just scary stuff.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the scary stuff, and I don't want to take too much away from Anderson, but we are working on a project together about supporting trans patrons in libraries. And there was a conversation a while back of like, is this a research goal that we want to continue to pursue in light of
everything?
And we are continuing to pursue it, but there's also this sort of intersection of privacy in that research interest where privacy and confidentiality in the library and the digital security that plays in with all of the digital electronic resources that we have. How can we protect our trans patrons? How can we keep their identities as an institution that has access to their personal information? How can we keep that secure, and prevent ourselves from essentially creating a database of all the trans people in our institution?
We don't need to make lists. And that it's bouncing off of that. When you were a librarian in a 21st century library, you're having to balance a lot of different, sometimes competing needs. You have patrons that will need to use the library as a physical space to gather in, to socialize, to look at physical books on the stacks, but you also have a large number of your patrons that are accessing remotely. And sometimes, especially when it comes to students who are living in unsupportive homes, sometimes the digital, more anonymous seeming option is actually less secure for their privacy. And so then you need to figure out a way that they can be secure in an in-person physical space, even though in some ways that seems like we're being a little bit old-fashioned. And you constantly have to look at these needs and values in comparison with one another, and make sure that there aren't any patron groups that are being left out. And you are having to look at it not just digitally, but also in terms of how people are physically interacting in your space. Are they going to this is not something most libraries do, but if you have a self-checkout kiosk, are your security cameras pointed in such a way that the books that students or patrons are checking out, the titles get picked up on that, and then there's a record of it. Most libraries know not to do that. That's something that we as the profession have identified as like a one particular way of making your physical spaces more private, and have been for a while. But that's just one example.
Well, you mentioned the everything, and you mentioned the space of the library, and you mentioned a while, right? Library and information studies have been discussing issues of surveillance and privacy for quite a long time, right? So why do you think that libraries have been leaders in these conversations? And why is it important for libraries to continue to be central locations for activism against surveillance?
You want me to take first half, you take second half?
Yeah.
Okay. So whenever I think about libraries and surveillance, the first place I go to is the Bush administration and the Patriot Act. There was a concerted effort in the wake of 9/11 to find out what people in America what information they're looking up, what books they're reading. Are people encountering any dangerous ideas? And one of the ways that this manifested is that people's library lending records were available to be taken as evidence by law enforcement. And the way that the laws were phrased meant that libraries could not inform patrons that their records had been viewed or that there had been people asking to view records. And so in the aftermath of this, law change with the Patriot Act, libraries nationwide kind of had a conversation about what information needs to be retained, why, for how long, and how you can comply with the letter of the law while still serving your patrons and protecting their privacy. And the general consensus that most libraries in the States came to was that you don't need to maintain patron records for lending at all. If a patron turns their book back in, it's as if it was never there. You can't look at somebody's lending history under most library systems. And they wanted to make sure that the only information that they were retaining was what's necessary to make sure that you get your books back at the end of the lending period. And there were also situations, although some of this may be apocryphal knowledge that gets passed on to new library science students, but one of the recurring images, at least for me, that was communicated about librarianship in the early 2000s, where there were libraries that would put up printed signs on their message boards, like physical corkboard signs that say, no federal agents have come to request library records this week. Please pay attention for the removal of this sign, because that was the only way that you could adequately communicate that information. I don't know how many libraries actually went that far, and I don't know how often those signs actually got used, but that was the climate of surveillance, fear, and scrutiny that libraries were under during this time period. And the librarians that were working in that time, a lot of cases have gone on to be library science professors in library science schools or mentors for younger librarians. And so it's been this passing on of, hey, back in like 2004, things were really rough. It can get that rough again. Please pay attention and make sure that your patrons' records are not being accumulated in some form that somebody can just reach over and take them. And that's kind of how that came to be, at least from my perspective, a major issue in librarianship as a profession.
Zephyr, what's part two to this?
So the part two
answer?
is, I think, the why, and the why is from the beginning of this era of librarianship, of open stacks and of free lending and the building up of the ALA. The number one goal of libraries has been intellectual freedom. And realistically, intellectual freedom is impossible in a surveillance state. If you don't feel like you have the ability to check out any book, to access any website, to learn any information that you want or need, to access any entertainment needs that you have, then you can't feel like you are safe. And so the idea of like pushing for this intellectual freedom, for pushing for all of our patrons are able to access anything that they might need to access, we have to protect their ability to do that by protecting them from the people who might want to stop them from doing that
For whatever reason.
for whatever reason.
Can I ask a kind of a clarifying question that might open up a whole can of worms here?
Okay, do it.
But you're talking very generally like, libraries.
Mhm.
Is there a big difference between like public libraries and university libraries, how we approach these kinds of issues, ideas?
There's a little bit of a difference there. I would say the main big difference is school libraries.
Yeah.
So school libraries answer to the school board. They don't answer to like a library board.
Okay.
And so they are held to a different standard, and the adults at a school are considered to be in charge of and responsible for all of the students at that school. And so they are under a lot more censorship there than at a public library or a university library. Public libraries are sort of in this weird middle ground because they answer to a library board, and the library board answers usually to a local or state government, depending on where you are. So where you are. And so some libraries are going to be more able to push for intellectual freedom, to, not keep lending records, to do those things than others. And you'll see a lot of like bigger public library systems have more freedoms to do that than like a very small town rural library with one person running it.
Mhm.
Academic libraries answer to the institution that they are a part of. So especially at public universities, I would say that we are the most able to push for intellectual freedom of all the libraries. That's not like always going to be true 100% of the time, but because institutions of higher education already push for academic freedom in a lot of cases, the library is held to that same standard.
Also, at an academic library, you have your whole faculty of people who are relying on the access to these resources for their classes and their own independent research. And so if a library collection in an academic library starts to be curtailed to the point that it's no longer useful to its faculty researchers and its student researchers, there's going to be a lot more immediate pushback from people who have the ability to make their voices heard through whatever institutional structures there are for addressing grievances and complaints on a university campus. A public library, there isn't that structure. These are just people that are existing in the wild. They're family members, they are kids, they are senior citizens, they are people that are not necessarily hooked into anything where they can say, I was allowed to have access to these resources for 20 years. Why are they suddenly gone? They can talk to their library board. They can talk to local government. They can talk to library employees, but there's not a guarantee that there will be a mechanism to where that can be heard, because it's not, the assumption is not that this is then tied to their livelihood. And so those voices don't get treated as seriously a lot of the time. Plus, we don't have as many children on university campuses. Not to say that we don't have any, but that is a complicating factor, because currently where the goalpost is for a lot of the censorship efforts at libraries nationwide It's under the idea that the censorship is being done to protect children. And so they're targeting school libraries and public libraries very fiercely. The goalposts always move, and I'm sure that if it is allowed to move unchecked, we will soon be seeing, oh, this 24-year-old is basically a child, and we need to protect them too from the scary books.
Yeah, their parent is still paying the tuition. So.
Yeah, so but we're not quite there yet.
Yeah.
We're a little bit delayed in terms of where the front lines of the fight are.
Thank you.
So this panel is librarians and the director of writing. Many undergraduate classes, like first-year writing courses, right, and others, partner with the university library to support student research. This includes things like navigating academic databases, finding resources, and evaluating resources, right? That's important. So where do you all see the intersection between information literacy, right, and what we might call privacy literacies? Why do we need both? And can they even be separated at this point?
I'm laughing because I wrote this question and I don't know how to answer it. But so I'm thinking a lot about some of the work that we just did here in our writing program. We just did kind of a remodeling of our curriculum that included kind of pumping up a lot of our information literacies and really trying to reconnect our classes very intentionally to the resources here in the library. And while we were putting that curriculum together, we were very much focused on the information literacies we thought would be most important to a first year writing research class, and traditionally thinking in terms of source, finding sources, evaluating sources, that kind of stuff. And as I'm thinking back now, I'm really kind of regretting not building in more about privacy literacies in the curriculum. And it's something that I want to go back to, because as I've gotten deeper into this kind of research and have conversations with both of you, really thinking about how these have become inseparable, how even if we're making taking steps on our side to protect privacy of students or privacy of patrons in your kind of parlance, really thinking about how do we help students prepare to protect themselves. And I think that that's a real opportunity that first year writing and other courses, but in this community, first year writing really needs to take more seriously, and something I want to go back and keep thinking about. But yeah, I want to kind of also throw it over to y'all, because I wonder how that would fit into, say, like a classroom visit.
So when I do classroom visits and talk to students about just research basics and information evaluation basics, one of the things that I always like to emphasize with them is the idea of the fact that information is not passive, it is active. There is a purpose for why information was created and made available, and oftentimes why it is being presented to you as an individual information seeker. And so I try to talk to students about, sometimes there will be occasions when you are going out and finding information, but more often than not, the information is going out and finding you. And you need to always ask yourself, what is the purpose of that? What are they trying to do by presenting me with this information? Is this a piece of advertising? Is this something that is a political point that is being pushed, that they're trying to make me believe? Is someone trying to make me afraid of something so that I am more likely to go along with something else? And I think this goes along with privacy pretty neatly, because we on the internet we often feel like we are information consumers, but most of the time we are the product. People are trying to get their information in front of you as efficiently as possible, whatever it takes. With LGBTQ individuals, we are often targeted with ads for rainbow colored alcohol during Pride Month. Just because they're like, isn't it sad right now? Wouldn't some vodka make it better? And so you look at stuff like that and you're like, this is information. It's not a research need, but it's something I'm still trying to have to look at and say, why am I being shown this? What about me has been identified to make me seem like an easy mark for whatever product, idea, or concept is being pushed? And that also ties in with what information about me is getting out there. What profile has been made of me on these third-party advertising sites? And it's sometimes the advertisements come in the form of clickbait news that is just trying to get you on their shady site. I have family members that I will have to say, like, hey, where did you find this? Is this a real website? It has a really it has a title that made you really upset and you wanted to go click it. Do you have like a firewall on your computer now that you have clicked it? And so it's just this negotiation process of what are they trying to get from you? And I think that those two ideas are linked. And without the privacy piece, the please be aware that everyone is trying to either sell you or sell you something piece doesn't really click.
I want to ask a follow-up.
Okay.
We pose this idea of privacy literacy or privacy literacies, right, as practice. So I'm putting you on the spot here, but each of you, what's one or two things you would say to a student that kind of explains what it means to be privacy literate or to practice privacy literacy?
You want to go first or you want me to go first?
You can go first.
So one of the things that I would say is don't consider it a foregone conclusion that your privacy is already gone. That is something that a lot of people believe. They think that it's not worth it to protect their data, their personal information, etc., because they assume, well, everybody's already stealing my data. Why not let this steal my data too? And so trying to like claw back against that apathy is something that I really try to encourage. There's still a need to protect it. There's even more of a need to protect it. The other thing I would say is just what you have is worth protecting. Even if it seems like it's relatively minor and might not be useful in some way that you can construe to some outside third party, your identity, your life, your interests, your research interests is still something that these people don't have a right to. And that inherently is enough of a reason to want to protect it. Even if it doesn't result in identity theft or you losing your job because somebody looked at your browsing history, it's still worth protecting.
Zephyr, what do you think about this question about what it means to be privacy literate?
I like to go back to in my first class in library school, there was this debate posed by my professor that was like, does information intrinsically have value? And the conclusion was, of course it does. If it didn't have value, these companies wouldn't pay so much money for it. So just like being aware of that, of your information is valuable to you, but it is also valuable to others. And not everyone that it's valuable to is looking out for your best interests. So that's the first one. And then the second one, and this is less me thinking about how I would talk to students and more me thinking about the things I have told my sister, who is in college but not here.
She's not watching this Zoom.
No. It's not like a one size fits all. You're going to be able to just, find a list of 10 steps to protect your privacy online, do all of those things, and then you're good for the rest of your life. It's going to be constantly learning, like, who's trying to get my information? How are they getting my information? What steps can I take there? And then taking that system that you've developed and moving it forward the next time that they have moved on to getting past what you have protected
Yeah.
the last time.
And that's how it's illiteracy.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna shamelessly drop some work that Charles and I have been doing, because I think one of the big things that has been surprising to me is I feel like, yeah, people want my data, obviously.
Who would?
Who wouldn't? But what has been very persuasive to me in a not so great way is when companies present themselves as caring about your privacy. And so Charles and I have been doing some research on the way that companies use like design and things to kind of welcome you in and say, we care about your privacy. We're gonna, we do these magical things so you're safe. And then you look at their actual privacy policies and they're just as bad as any other kind of tech company that you would work with. So I think that's something that isn't a basic privacy literacy, perhaps, but something that I would want to kind of pose as a
Yeah.
important way of thinking about, why privacy matters. It matters to the point that they're willing to kind of smoke and mirrors you away from it.
Zephyr and I are laughing because this morning we read a press release by an ed tech company that I will not name because they seem very lawsuit happy, and I am very.
You can tell me after.
Yeah, I will. I'll give you. I'll send it to you. It's
Yeah.
insane. But they were literally like going in and addressing, as if like addressing a straw man, all of these different privacy and intellectual property concerns people have raised with their product, and just presenting them in the most disingenuous way possible, and then saying at the end of everything, our lawyers have checked it. We're 100% following the law in all of these countries, except we're not going to mention the EU because, it's fine. But the United States says it's cool, and the UK says it's cool, so it's fine. And they just went through again and again, and the bottom line was we haven't broken any laws. And then they keep saying that again and again, and it kept also coming back to honest students have nothing to fear from our product. And I'm like, that was like a direct quote. Like, did you run this by anybody that has ever read like a dystopian novel or history or anything? I feel like this is going to be like framed in a museum 60 years from now as like a piece of propaganda literature.
Yeah.
But we read this morning and we just were flabbergasted by how much they were really pushing the idea that any complaint people might have about their product is just college students being precious, and they're above board 100%, and you should trust them. And not only should you trust them, your university has an obligation to your students to use them. And we're just like, oh man.
As we're hitting the halfway point here, I want to encourage virtual attendees to add questions to the chat if you'd like. And we've got some time built in later for that. We've been a lot of places in the first 30 minutes. Right? Patriot Act, doing this work in Texas amid changing legislation. The importance of vodka.
Yeah.
One thing we haven't talked about yet is artificial intelligence. So we've been having conversations about AI here at TAMUC. Most of those have revolved around publicly available AI and large language models and implications for intellectual property, right? For IP. So what are some of your concerns generally, right? As well as maybe some situational or court cases that you all think that we should be following or keeping up to date on with whatever changes in practice and or policy that are coming our way regarding AI.
I can start. So I'll start on the court cases and changing policy portion of this. So one place to keep an eye out for changing policies in the United States, at least, is the Federal Trade Commission. They are on the issue of AI very intensely. They have a page on their site that they update just with news briefings and policy updates about it. Right now, they are hosting a virtual summit on AI and copyright. It's actually this Thursday they're hosting it. And then I think because it's a government institution, the recordings get posted after. And they're also doing something that I find really interesting. They're doing a challenge call on voice cloning. And so they just closed this month on the 12th, this challenge. And so basically what it is they issued an open call for anybody that wanted to propose a solution to the problems of voice cloning and the harms that it can cause through things like fraud, abuse, and other nefarious purposes.
And voice cloning is just
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah, using AI to copy somebody else's voice.
Okay.
You've seen this in news articles about scammers borrowing some sweet little old lady's grandchild's voice and say like, Nana, I need some money. Can you wire it to me? And then she goes, okay, yeah, sure. And then gives her life savings to a scammer.
Yeah.
And you also see it with situations where politicians' voices get cloned, celebrities' voices get cloned saying horrible things. There have been some cases where people have pretended to have kidnapped someone's loved one. Like there are so many horrifying use cases for voice cloning. And the FTC's challenge is asking members of the public to present potential ways of mitigating those harms, whether those are technological in nature, or if they're more in terms of like a PSA so that people are aware of it, just any sort of way of putting a bandage on the problem of this. They closed submissions on the 12th. They're due to release the results. They said early 2024. I don't know what that means. But they said in the challenge description that if it turns out that there aren't band-aid solutions that people can do as part of, the free market, or, just telling people be aware of this, that is going to be taken as a sign that the government is going to need to come in and regulate these technologies from like a legislative level. Because if there isn't a way to mitigate that harm any other way, that's kind of the next step. Beyond that, the U.S. Copyright Office is doing, they've issued a notice of inquiry on copyright and AI that they're going to be doing for, I think like a year. They're going to be releasing the results of that study after it's done. And then there are also a lot of lawsuits happening. The New York Times has recently sued OpenAI and Microsoft because they say that they've infringed on their copyright. And something that I found interesting from that lawsuit is they didn't ask for a specific monetary amount in damages. They said they will have to cover the damages, but if it's found that OpenAI, ChatGPT, and then Microsoft AIs are found to have significantly scraped New York Times content and used that to profit by creating AI-generated news competitor sites, the New York Times is asking that those AI systems be destroyed if they have been trained on stolen data. And so it's a very large lawsuit. I would watch out for that one. I would also watch out for the class action lawsuit that has been going on since the summer of authors versus OpenAI and Microsoft. There's also recently, Anthropic Claude is being sued by the music industry, by a lot of their like large labels are suing them because they say that Claude has been sharing copyrighted lyrics with users. Claude's response was really funny to me because they said, why would someone use one of the most cutting edge AI tools in the world to look up song lyrics when they can just use Google for that? I've talked to 4 or 5 students this week, and it's Tuesday, who tell me that they use AI as a search engine, which don't do that, please. But people are using that. They said no reasonable, normal person would use our tool as a search engine. It's something else. And I'm like, you guys don't know what people are using your product for.
Mhm.
Where have you been? But yeah, so that's on the horizon. We don't know yet, but keep an eye out. Things are moving.
Zephyr, Gavin, do you want to add anything on this topic? Or should we open up the conversation to thinking about AI within the landscape of larger ed tech tools?
The fear.
The fear.
Let's go in that direction. I just want to say that I've learned a whole lot about like the court cases from Anderson, so I'm just really excited to continue following your wake on that one.
It's because I'm stressed out. And when I'm stressed out, I just read everything. So that's where I am right now.
Wouldn't some rainbow vodka help?
Well, this theme of policy and legislation, right, is something that we're getting to at some point in each of these questions. But when we do take the topic of artificial intelligence and place it within the larger ed tech, sphere, is promise and compelling benefits. But oftentimes these benefits come at the cost of higher levels of surveillance on students, including data collection by third parties, or even the retention of student intellectual work as a part of a commercial data set, right? So in light of the fact that most ed tech is unavoidable for most students, faculty and staff on campus, how can colleges and universities ensure that people are able to reasonably consent to how those technologies collect and use data? Dr. Johnson, let's start with you.
Well, first of all, we have to be more transparent about it. I think I've been saying this to a few people, but I don't ever remember consenting to, like, knowledgeably consenting to using our learning management system here on campus or any campus that I've ever been on. It's just been, here's a learning management system, use it. Now, you're required to, in many cases, faculty, you have to put your stuff through the LMS. And what I'm wondering is like, well, where does that kind of informed, reasonable consent come in? How do we make that more transparent? Does it mean that we don't have just a kind of blanket, if you continue using this, you have consented to it, as opposed to, you have to actually go through and understand what's happening with your data when you use these. The kind of reverse question is, well, would we then, or would universities then also be able to provide an alternative for someone who does not consent? And I think that many universities would be like, no. We spend however many millions of dollars on this license, use the thing that we're spending money on. So that's something that I'm really interested in right now, is like, how do we make those how do we make the kind of data collection that goes through the kind of mundane technologies of education more visible? And are there alternatives possible that aren't completely like Luddite in application? Because I don't think just like completely reverting to whatever we were doing in 1981 will help.
We're being surveilled in 1981 too.
Exactly.
Right. Zephyr, my brain for acronyms is not with me today. What does VPAT stand for?
Voluntary. Let me just look it up.
Yeah.
I've processed so many VPATs.
Yeah. So VPAT is a certificate, like a disclosure of an EdTech tools accessibility, basically. It's a disclosure of their accessibility features, and if students can access that using a screen reader or something that's designed to help with like mobility, and a lot of university libraries, but also other parts of the university apparatus, look at the presence of a VPAT as one of the deciding factors on whether they're going to spend the money on that technology. You don't want to spend money on something that's not going to be useful for a percentage of your students. I would love to see something like that for privacy, data collection, and stuff like that, that's going to be in human readable language in a concise way that people who are making purchasing and technology decisions for institutions can look at and say, well, these people are going to retain student work. These people aren't. I'm going to spend money on these guys. That will require a significant amount of work on convincing companies to do the right thing, which I know is a pipe dream. But if I had a magic wand that I could force all corporations to just give themselves like a receipt that you have to read before you buy their product, that would be what I would do. That would be how I would implement that. Because it should be part of the decision-making process. So much of the money that is spent at a university goes towards these technologies that are supposed to help the students. A lot of that money comes from student fees.
Mhm.
They should be able to have a reasonable, actionable way of knowing if that technology is going to be harmful to those students too.
Anderson, it sounds like what you're calling for when you triangulate the institution and the students and the third parties is for a shared responsibility among all stakeholders.
Yes, that is my take.
Excellent.
I'm gonna that little smile that you've got. That's my soapbox.
Yeah. Zephyr, do you want to jump in here on this
Yes,
topic?
I will say VPAT, voluntary product accessibility template,
Thank you.
and then
Voluntary part of that is the problem,
it is-
isn't it?
it's funny because
Be a patch.
anything that we have on campus has to do it.
Yeah, we
So
have a policy that if it doesn't have a VPAT, we can't.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then the actual filled out, because the VPAT is the template, the actual filled out version is the ACR, and that's where we actually get the information. And that's not my job anymore, but it used to be for the library, making sure that we had those ACRs for everything that we had technology wise.
Yeah.
And like on that, there is a little bit of what you're asking for. It does sort of exist because everything we have on campus that has any sort of cloud computing possibilities has to be TextRamp certified.
Yes.
And so that information is not as transparent as I would like it to be, and it's not as easy for like students and faculty and regular human people to find as I would like it to be. And even then, it's not always in the most readable language when you can find it, but it does
It's a start.
exist.
For our non-Texas people, can we quickly define what TETRAMP is?
So I don't remember what it stands for because acronyms are
Because
not,
acronyms.
because acronyms, but there is a similar thing at the federal level. It's called FedRAMP.
Ramp.
Good to know.
Let me just look up what the ramp stands for.
Dr. Palmer, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I had a question story, which is, I have in the past used plagiarism detection software. I apologize.
We're gonna chase you out of the building.
And I got an email that I've never gotten before from this company saying another teacher found a 2% similarity to one of my students' work, which seems minute. And they wanted my permission for that entire answer the student gave to be shared with this teacher so that she can compare them manually. I've never seen this before, but I guess my question is, why am I the person to give consent for the student's work to be shared? And from what I understand, students have not consented to this at all. It just is something that the professor used. What are the actual rules around this? What's going on?
I'm gonna send you that press release too after this. Yeah.
I'm just confused. Who actually owns the property of students' work?
So from a US copyright standpoint, the person that creates the work owns the work from the moment it is in a tangible form, whether they register it with the Copyright Office or not, once you write that paper, it belongs to you. That's how it works. In practice, that's not necessarily how it's going to shake out. There are various court cases that have determined that schools have a legitimate reason for retaining students' intellectual property and using it for assessment purposes, which makes sense. It gets into some murky waters once it gets to the point where it's not just the student and the instructor and the institution, it's also this outside force that keeps it and retains it in perpetuity.
Mhm.
But if you ask the lawyers of the plagiarism detection companies, it is 100% legal, which doesn't mean it's right.
I
Yeah.
mean, one of the things that I'm just kind of running this through my head, this is not, I don't know if this is actually the thing and the reason why you're being asked, but I wonder if it's something to do with the fact that you're the one, or the teacher is the one who submits the thing, so it turns it into this other tangible thing. That's just like me trying to logic through some of this.
It feels like it's not so much assuming that the instructor has copyright or intellectual property rights over it, but the fact that they are meaningfully the person that is the user responsible for that
Mhm.
Yeah, that
within the
makes sense.
system. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm also wondering, how would somebody, so say this person's in, you know, another state or something, how would they even see my student's paper unless it, like,
It's
got-
in the data set.
Yeah,
It's in the-
exactly. Like,
Yeah.
it just seems like it's a good way for work to get stolen, actually.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Yeah.
carried on.
Yep.
I want to ask if there are any questions in the chat. Morgan Banville has been monitoring the chat, and we have a couple of folks here as well.
We have a few links in the chat, which I encourage everyone to look at.
Excellent. And any
but
questions in the in
No
person as
questions
well?
so far. I will say, while I'm thinking about it, the RAMP is Risk and Authorization Management Program. So it's essentially a risk assessment versus what benefit does this bring?
Mhm.
Is it safe enough for it to be used by public institutions? Texas has their own set
Because
of
of course.
criteria they use.
Right.
It is, as far as I'm aware, in line with the federal criteria. I haven't read the federal criteria, and I read the Texas one a year ago. So I can't promise that I remember.
Well, you bring up Texas, right? And this is kind of something we've talked around a little bit in some of our questions. But let's kind of, this can be a kind of a final question. We're thinking about educational surveillance in all its forms. And we think about how they intersect with issues of inequality, bias, and discrimination on university campuses. When we think about the library, right, as well, in Texas, amid changing legislation, many teachers and librarians have reported a chilling effect, right, among themselves, their colleagues, and their students. So I guess my question is, how has this idea of free inquiry on college campuses changed recently in your roles as educators in Texas?
Mhm.
And that's a big question that we don't have a whole lot of time to answer, but I'll leave
Well-
it with you.
Well, I think the first thing that we have to point out is that free inquiry and free speech are purposefully weaponized.
Mhm.
So really thinking about, you know, the arguments that we're shutting down this content because you are infringing on the free inquiry of
Another group.
this other person. And the hypocrisy is obviously ignored in that situation, but really, I mean, it's really concerning, more than concerning, how it's all kind of unfolding and the way that that can be further weaponized through kind of the technologies that run our campuses. My constant example is, you know, we in January of 23 got a memo like there was an executive order from the governor's office. TikTok is now banned on all state property. And, all it took for that to happen was the good folks in IT following what they had to follow, just put a block on the site. And so TikTok is no longer, available through network. And so I'm always curious, but also fearful of the way that we've built these infrastructures to so easily shut down things like free inquiry, community building, activism, on and on and on and on.
And not to say that TikTok doesn't have its own massive safety risks.
Absolutely.
But back in January, I'd asked like how the TikTok ban plays into the idea that like if you are doing email from your personal phone, is your personal phone then something that you are using to conduct state business? And then can you be banned from using TikTok on your personal phone? And the answer is yes. And so it's a situation where there is a lot of reach going on and some erosion of the lines between who are you as a state employee and who are you as an individual citizen. Also, side point, talking also about semi-recent Texas legislature, Senate Bill 17 is putting a limit on DEI content being discussed in the state of Texas on university campuses. And it goes, the bill makes sure to carve out space for instructors being allowed to talk about whatever they want in their classrooms, assuming that the content relates to their class and is discussed in their syllabus and is necessary for the course and is not just like a extraneous thing. And also that people are allowed to research and do creative products however they need to without fear of this law stamping down on them. Librarians are in a weird twilight zone here because in a lot of universities, librarians are faculty, but do not teach courses. And so we don't have syllabi that outline what we might need to talk to a student about. We don't have, like a classroom that is our personal domain that we can choose what the topic of conversation is. In my line of work as a research and instruction librarian, my job is to meet any faculty, staff, or student that has a research question in any subject, regardless of what that question is. And I need to be able to help them get access to the information that they need to solve that research question, whether that's for class or for a personal project or something that they're just curious about. We don't often ask why they need that information because it's not relevant to us. And it can even stifle that person's curiosity and make them feel like they're being judged for needing this information. So we're in a position where we have to assist anybody in any reason. And there has been a bit of a concern about what does this mean? Because oftentimes these research consultations take place in public. Somebody will approach the desk and ask for help, or they'll ask us to come over to one of the public computers and help them find things on a database. And we don't have an explicit protection within the law saying that we're allowed to say what we want to as it relates to our course. But it is what we need to do for our jobs.
Right.
And so we can't just say, no, I'm sorry, I can't help you find this. That would be I wouldn't be a very good librarian if I did that.
I don't think you would be a librarian.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think at that point you just kind of have to hang your hat up and like leave. But it's definitely a period of uncertainty because, what do we do?
Yeah.
We're not professors. We're faculty and we're researchers and we're research aides. Yeah, we're research librarians.
Yeah.
But where are we?
We're at the top of the hour.
We are.
Zephyr, final word from you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the other thing is we've talked about this in the library, but students are also experiencing that
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
not being sure what they're allowed to research, and especially younger students who are just coming out of high school, who don't have a few years of university, like academic freedom under their belt to be like, oh, I see where the line is drawn in this law. They're just like, well, this says I can't look at any of these
Yep.
things, so I won't. Even if that's something that they would need or want to know about. And so it's just like trying to encourage students, like, no, you are protected, you can research whatever you need, while also for us, like Anderson said, not throwing ourselves under the bus.
Mhm.
A poignant point to end on, I think, to emphasize that this is not just impacting us, but it's also impacting our students, right? Excuse me. Thank you to Gavin, Zephyr, and Anderson. This has been Privacy, Intellectual Property, and the Future of Free Inquiry on College Campuses. We have events for DRPC Privacy Week the rest of the week, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, and you can register for those at drpcollective.com. Thanks, everybody.